Autonomy. It's one of those words we don't use in everyday conversation, but we feel it deeply. When someone makes decisions for us, speaks on our behalf, touches us without asking, or claims ownership of something that was never theirs. Autonomy is the right to govern oneself, your body, your choice. But history is full of people who had to fight to claim it, over their blood, their bodies, and even their identities. Today on 10-Minute History, we're diving into 3 stories where autonomy was stolen, fought for, and sometimes painfully complicated. We'll start in the 1980s, New York City, where Haitians were being told that their blood was dirty. Then we'll move to the story of Henrietta Lacks, a Black woman whose cells changed the world without her ever knowing. And at the end, we will go with 2 men, Chang and Eng Bunker, conjoined twins who defied the odds only to become slave owners themselves. Let's start with the protests you've probably never heard of. The early 1980s were filled with confusion, fear, and hysteria around a new disease. It didn't have a name at first, just symptoms: immune system failings, bodies wasting away, strange infections doctors couldn't explain. Eventually, it would come to be known as AIDS. The CDC rushed to find patterns, and in 1983, they published a list of what they called risk groups: gay men, intravenous drug users, hemophiliacs, and Haitians. There wasn't strong specific evidence. Just a few cases of AIDS had been identified among Haitian immigrants, mostly living in New York and Florida. But instead of investigating the individuals and looking deeper, the CDC took a shortcut, and it devastated an entire community. Suddenly, being Haitian in America meant being suspect. People were fired from jobs, kids were bullied at school, Haitian-owned businesses saw customers vanish overnight, and most notably, Haitians were banned from donating blood. Imagine living through the height of the AIDS crisis, and even as you try to help, to donate blood, to be a part of the solution, you're turned away. Not because of your actions, but because of your identity. The community didn't take this lying down. On October 24th, 1990, over 100,000 Haitians marched across the Brooklyn Bridge in protest, shouting, "We are not a risk group. We are human beings." Haitian doctors and nurses organized teach-ins. Churches became places of activism. Students held sit-ins and walkouts. And local newspapers like the Haitian Observer and Haitian Progress began publishing blistering critiques of American public health policy. This wasn't just about blood. It was about dignity, about fighting back against a label that dehumanized an entire people. By 1985, the CDC quietly removed Haitians as a separate category. But the damage was done. Fear had already metastasized into discrimination. And yet, there's something powerful about that refusal. Haitians didn't just accept stigma, they rejected it loudly, publicly, in the streets of New York and the pages of local papers. They demanded autonomy over their bodies, their blood, and their identity. Our next story is also about autonomy, bodily autonomy. But this time, it wasn't refused. It was taken. And that's the story of Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks was born in Roanoke, Virginia in 1920. She was a Black woman from a family of tobacco farmers, descended from people who had been enslaved. After her mother died when she was just 4 years old, Henrietta was sent to live with her grandfather in a 2-story log cabin that had once been a slave quarter on a plantation. She married David Lax, and eventually moved to Turner Station in Baltimore, one of the oldest African American communities in the area. In 1951, Henrietta went to Johns Hopkins Hospital complaining of pain in her abdomen. It was one of the few hospitals that would treat Black patients at the time. There, she was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cervical cancer. As doctors began radiation treatment, they did something else without telling her. They cut small samples from her tumor and sent them to a nearby lab. This wasn't unusual at the time. Ethics around patient consent were very loose, especially for Black patients, and if you were poor and Black, it was even worse. But what happened next was extremely unusual. Her cells didn't die. In fact, they continued to multiply, and they multiplied rapidly. They were unlike any human cell researchers had ever seen. They called them HeLa cells, named after Henrietta Lacks, after the first two letters of her first and last name. HeLa cells would go on to change science forever. They were used to test the polio vaccine. They became crucial in cancer and AIDS research. They helped develop in vitro fertilization, gene mapping, even treatment for COVID-19 in later decades. Henrietta, meanwhile, passed away just months after her diagnosis. She was buried in an unmarked grave at first, and her family didn't know her cells were still alive, being grown, shipped, sold, and experimented on until the 1970s. They didn't receive a dime. They didn't even know what cell culture meant. Imagine discovering that part of your mother is being used all over the world, and no one thought to ask you. For the Lack family, this wasn't about science. It was about justice, about consent, and about autonomy. Eventually, Henrietta's contributions were recognized. In 2010, her story was told in a best-selling book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Oprah produced an HBO film, and Johns Hopkins established a foundation for her in her name. But recognition came decades too late. Henrietta never got to reclaim her autonomy, but her story changed how the world thinks about ethics, race, and consent in medicine. Now, let's shift to the 1800s. Two men were born sharing a body, and who spent their lives demanding autonomy, but at a terrible cost. Let's take it back to 1811, across the globe in a small village in the Mekong Delta, in what was then known as Siam, today Thailand. Two boys were born into poverty, joined at the chest and by a band of cartilage and a shared liver. Their names were Chang and Eng. From the moment they entered the world, they were seen as different, mainly because they were conjoined twins. In their village, some believed that they were a bad omen. Their mother tried to shield them, but even she couldn't prevent the whispers and the stigma at the time. When the twins were in their teens, a Scottish businessman named Robert Hunter noticed them while traveling in the region. Hunter, sensing an opportunity, partnered with an American sea captain named Abel Coffin and convinced the twins, through persuasion and probably manipulation, to travel abroad as part of a world tour. The Bunker twins didn't speak English. They didn't know what they were signing up for. In 1829, they arrived in the United States and quickly became a sensation. They were advertised in circus acts as Siamese twins. They were put on display in hotels, theaters, exhibition halls across the United States and Europe. People paid to watch them, to ask them invasive questions. Doctors poked and prodded them, fascinated by their autonomy. But here's the thing. Chang were smart. They watched. they learned. And after a few years of being exploited, they said, enough. They had saved their money. In 1832, they broke off their contract and struck out on their own. They became independent performers, booking their own appearances, managing their own money. Their charisma made them popular. They weren't just curiosities anymore. They were celebrities. And they became rich celebrities very fast as well. And not just show business rich, landowner rich, plantation rich. They settled in the foothills of North Carolina, where they became naturalized citizens. They settled in the foothills of North Carolina, where they became naturalized U.S. citizens. That's also when they took the name Bunker. They brought over 1,000 acres of land and built side-by-side homes in the town of Mount Airy. Yes, the same Mount Airy that would later inspire the Andy Griffith Show. But this is where the story turns dark. In order to farm that land, Chang and Eng brought enslaved African Americans. Records show that they enslaved at least 18 people to work their property, raising crops like tobacco and corn. It's a hard contradiction to sit with. Two men who were once treated like objects, who fought for their own dignity and freedom, turning around and denying that same humanity to others. In 1843, the twins married sisters, Adeline and Sarah Yates, daughters of a local landowner. The relationships were deeply controversial. Interracial marriage was illegal at the time, but there was no law against a conjoined Asian man marrying a white woman, and the community didn't quite know how to handle it. The Bunkers moved forward anyway. They built two houses about a mile apart and developed a strict routine. 3 days in one house, then 3 days in the other. Each twin had his own wife, his own children, and his own version of a home, while still being attached to his brother. Between them, they fathered 21 children. Chang had 10 and Eng had 11. Their children would go on to become teachers, farmers, and even a sheriff. And many of their descendants are still alive today, living in the American South. As the twins aged, their health declined, especially Chang's. He suffered a stroke in 1870 that left his right side paralyzed and made him increasingly dependent on Eng, his brother. Chang also developed a drinking problem, possibly a coping mechanism from his pain and reduced mobility. On January 17, 1874, the brothers went to sleep in Eng's house. The next morning, Eng woke up to find Chang cold and unresponsive. He panicked. There was no time to call a doctor, none close enough. The twins were still physically connected, and no one knew how to safely separate them. Eng reportedly said that I am going, and lay back down. 3 hours later, he was dead too. Some accounts say Eng died from shock and grief. Others believe the body began to shut down once Eng's organs stopped functioning. An autopsy was performed, and the connection between them, a shared liver, was studied extensively. Doctors concluded that an operation to separate them might have been possible, but it had not been seriously considered or attempted. Their death marked the end of a life unlike any other. They were buried in a grave in White Plain, North Carolina, under a tombstone that reads, Chang and Eng Butler, born in Siam, 1811, died in North Carolina, 1874. But their story lives on, not just as a medical marvel or a historical curiosity, but as a deep human tale of contradiction. They were exploited and became exploiters. They were paraded as objects and became wealthy landowners. They demanded autonomy in a society that denied it to others, and they themselves denied it to others too. Their story asks a difficult question. What do we do with our freedom? And who pays the price when we get it? That's your episode for today for 10-Minute History. I'm your host, Antonio Milian. Thank you guys for listening. And wherever you are listening, feel free to give our podcast 5 stars. And also, if you have any constructive criticism, feel free to leave it in the comments section below. Thank you guys again, and definitely take care of yourself.